is this recognition that we need to draw on a number of theories, models and frameworks, because if we stick to any one, that's going to lead to poor clinical practice. I want to start off by talking to you about a paper published in 1993 by Karamatsa and Hillis, two very well regarded neuropsychologists. And they wrote a paper called "For a Theory of Remediation of Cognitive Deficits." And they said in this paper, "We're not concerned with the question of whether cognitive models are helpful in rehabilitation, for surely they are. It is hard to imagine that efforts at therapeutic intervention would not be facilitated by having the clearest possible idea of what needs to be rehabilitated." Now, at first sight, we think, well, of course we agree with that. But what bothers me is this last bit, what needs to be rehabilitated. And this is where I feel many of the cognitive models do not tell us what needs to be rehabilitated. So, do models of cognitive functioning tell us what needs to be rehabilitated? Well, I'm not against models, they're very helpful. They're certainly helpful in identifying cognitive strengths and weaknesses. They're helpful in explaining phenomena that we see and in making predictions about behaviour. They tell us what cognitive constraints are on any programs we wish to implement. If we're working with somebody with a severe memory impairment, it's no good just explaining to them what's going to happen in the next few hours or days. If we're working with somebody with a severe language problem, we've got to adjust so that they understand. But they don't tell us what needs to be rehabilitated. So does this mean theories of cognitive functioning are not important? Well, of course not. Take the influential working memory model of Baddeley and Hitch in 1974, a model that I've been very influenced by in much of my work. That enables us to understand why somebody can have a normal immediate memory, say normal forward digit span, but major problems after a delay or distraction. Now, Alan Baddeley sometimes tells this story of way back in the 70s, he was working with a psychiatrist, and together they were seeing a patient who'd attempted suicide with carbon monoxide, and it had left her with a very severe amnesic syndrome. And like most amnesic patients, she had a normal immediate memory. Her forward digit span, absolutely fine. But the psychiatrist said she must be malingering. How can somebody with such a terrible memory manage to tell you 7 digits? And it was because of his lack of knowledge of things like the working memory model that he was able to make that mistake. Now, anybody that works with amnesic patients, people with the pure amnesic syndrome, have a normal digit span. I mean, that's one of the characteristics. So you need models to avoid those kinds of mistakes. The working memory model also enables us to understand why some people can have problems with visual memory or non-verbal memory, and others with verbal memory. And why they can have problems with executive functioning, despite having a normal phonological loop and visual spatial sketchpad and so on. And once we've established the particular problem of a person, for example, a deficit in the central executive or an inefficient delayed verbal memory, we don't set out to rehabilitate that. We don't set out to rehabilitate the central executive or the delayed verbal memory system. What we tend to do is identify the particular problems faced by the individual with these impairments, such as problems planning a meal or failure to use a notebook or whatever, and these are the kinds of things we rehabilitate. And what needs to be rehabilitated is not an impairment identified by a theoretically informed model, but a real-life problem identified by the patient and his or her family. And such problems may well be caused by the cognitive deficits, But in most cases, we don't try to rehabilitate the deficit so much as the everyday problems identified by the patient and his or her family. And another way we can consider that, and this was put up yesterday by one of our speakers, is the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health. Let's just get that there. So I think it was you, Dr. North, yesterday, who said that the neurologists are often focusing on this part of the model, but the psychologists like me, or the occupational therapists, or speech and language therapists, we're typically focusing on these parts of the model, how the problems manifest themselves in real life. That's what we're trying to rehabilitate. So this is yet another model that's had a big influence on how we understand rehabilitation. But models of cognitive functioning, as important as they are certainly not the only models that influence cognitive rehabilitation. And, repeating what I said earlier, rehabilitation is one of many fields that needs a broad theoretical base, incorporating frameworks, models, and methodologies from a number of different fields. But first, let's just say, what is a theory and what is a model? Well, this is the Oxford English Dictionary definition of a theory: a supposition or system of ideas explaining something, especially one based on general principles independent of the particular thing to be explained. And a model, a nice simple definition by Baddeley, who's very good at simplifying as complicated work, he says a model is simply a representation that can help us understand and predict related phenomena. We can have very sophisticated models, like models to predict the weather or parallel distributed processing systems, or we can have very simple models, like comparing memory to a library, or comparing people with problems with attention to a faulty switch analogy. It's just a way of trying to explain and represent some of these ideas. And in rehab, models are useful for facilitating thinking about assessment and treatment, explaining deficits to therapists and relatives. I mean, I use that working memory model all the time for memory impaired people and their families in a very simplified way. They enable us to conceptualize outcomes. And people with cognitive problems following brain injury, first of all, most of them, not all of them, but most of them will have several cognitive problems. I specialise in memory, but I rarely see people with a pure amnesic syndrome. They do come along, but they're not our bread and butter patients, our everyday patients. Most people are going to have a number of cognitive problems, so with attention, memory, executive functioning, word finding, and they're also going to have non-cognitive problems, particularly anxiety, depression, social skills deficits, etc. And it's very unlikely that any one model or theory or framework can address all of these difficulties. And being constrained by one theoretical model can lead to poor clinical practice. And to go back to the statement, Dr. Flanagan, that you made yesterday, you look for what you see, and what was it again? You see what you look for, and you look. We have to write this down, won't we? We're not remembering it, and we all think it's so important. But that's what happens if you just stick to one particular model. So let's agree then that we need to refer to several models and theories. Now, I've picked out some of the ones I think are particularly influential in rehabilitation, but there will be others. Models of cognitive functioning, we obviously have to know about those because we're working with people with cognitive impairments. We should know about models of learning. You know, a theory of rehabilitation without a model of learning is like a train without an engine, said Alan Baddeley in one of his papers. We certainly need to know about models of emotion. It's such a big thing in holistic rehab. Models of assessment. Now, some of you might think, neuropsychological assessment, that's just one style of doing things, the standardised test, but that's far from the truth. We should know something about models of recovery. partly is this change due to natural recovery, or would it have, is it due to our rehabilitation? And even if we're seeing people when the recovery phase is plateaued out, we still need to know something about models of recovery and plasticity. We need to know about the holistic models if we're in current modern day rehabilitation, and so on. Now, I started to look for one chapter I was writing about when the first description of models of rehab, and this was the earliest one I could find that actually addressed rehabilitation and talked about models of rehab. So Gross and Schutz, I think they're Israelis, aren't they? Yigal Gross is an Israeli, isn't he? Yeah. And they talked about several models. The environmental control model, the stimulus response conditioning model, the skill training model, the strategy substitution model, and the cognitive cycle model. Now, I'll say a little bit more about those in a little while. But these were the main models, they said. Now, I'm going to show you 2 video clips next of 2 very different amnesic patients. This first one, is the most amnesic patient I have ever known. He's recognised to have one of the most severe cases of amnesia in the world. He was a musician and a conductor and a great musical scholar. He actually played at the wedding of Charles and Diana. But he had herpes simplex encephalitis in 1985. And it's left him with the worst case of amnesia that I've ever seen. He can still play his music, and I'll show you a little bit of him, because the only thing that was ever able to help this man was the environmental control model, the simplest of these Gross and Schutz models. And then I will show you my star patient of all time, my star amnesic patient of all time, a young man who lives alone, is self-employed, so he earns his own living, and he fills in his own tax forms, which I can't do. I have to have help with that. Now, anybody that can do all those 3 things would, to most people in rehabilitation, be considered a good outcome. I mean, it is a good outcome. He's living alone, he's not costing anybody anything, fills in his own tax forms. And he I think, must be using this one, because he survives because he compensates so well. But I'll just show you the 2 very contrasting people at the moment, and then we'll come back to that model. So this is the musician, became ill in 1985, still very much the same today. I tend to see him about once a year now.
Clive Waring has one of the worst cases of amnesia in the world.
I know it's like to be dead now. Day and night, the same, blank. No difference between dreams and anything like that, no senses at all. The brain has been totally inactive. No dreams and no thoughts of any kind whatever.
Clive was a renowned conductor living in London when he was struck down by a virus in 1985. Parts of his brain were completely destroyed, including his memory. However, his ability to play music is unaffected.
Do you feel different when you play music?
I've never heard a note since I've been ill. I don't know what it's like to play music when you're unconscious.
You played us some music about 2 minutes ago.
Not known to me. Totally unknown. I've never heard a note yet.
Clive's case became known to millions when a television documentary was made about him in 1986. Alone and confused in hospital, without his memory, the only person he recognised was his wife, Deborah.
What's been wrong? Can you just tell me what the illness has been? I mean, I really can't get to this sort of
But
stuff. I'm actually conscious now for
yes.
the first time. I just want to find out what the bloody hell they've been doing, what's been wrong with me. Because I haven't a fucking clue.
Well,
I've
this
never seen
is-
anyone at all.
So that was the first patient who the only way to help him at all has been to adjust the environment he lives in and to adjust our verbal behaviour towards him. Now this is the second one. This is my star patient, the young man who can do almost everything, but with a huge effort, I might say. But this is just to show you the contrasts.
After a sudden brain hemorrhage while studying law at Cambridge 6 years ago, now every waking act is a triumph of will and organisation. His watch tells him what day it is, what job to do, when to go to work, to go home, to water the plants, everything.
You forget what you've done recently. You forget what you're going to be doing in the next few hours. It's a bit like watching a TV channel, watching a TV, where you've got 30 or 40 different channels, and every few minutes the channel's being changed, and you're on a completely new channel and you don't know what's just happened beforehand, and as soon as you get into the plot you're on a new channel.
Since the tragedy, only limited manual work is possible. Making wicker chairs occupies several hours a day, but with his pure intellect intact, he's developed a complex system of memory aids centered around his dictaphone and filofax.
My watch alarm has just sounded. I'm looking at my filofax. It's telling me that Barbara Wilson is coming to visit me at the moment. At 3 p.m. I phone James and Susan Harwell. If I didn't even have a filofax or a diary, then I wouldn't even be able to go out shopping. I wouldn't be able to visit anybody at all. If I had to rely purely on things I could remember, I wouldn't be able to do anything. Hello, James. On the 28th of February at 8 p.m, James and Susan Harwell are going to come over for dinner. I went out to see Barbara Wilson. In the afternoon, I phoned James Harwell.
Organisation makes independent life possible, but records are no substitute for memories.
The most frustrating thing about my life is when when a friend leaves me in an evening, I don't know what I've talked with them about that evening. Something may be on my tape, but I probably haven't remembered much at all.
Okay, so they're two very different people. And very different treatment approaches, of course. But going back to the Gross and Schutz models, they say these models are hierarchical. Patients who cannot learn are treated with the environmental control techniques. Clive might be an example there. Patients who can learn but can't generalise need stimulus response conditioning. Patients who can learn and generalise but can't self-monitor should be given skill training. Those who can self-monitor will benefit from strategy substitution, and those who can manage all of the above and are able to set their own goals will be best suited for treatment that is incorporated within the cognitive cycle model. Well, that's what they say, and it looks very neat, but I think it's problematic. How can you agree what patients can learn and which patients can generalise? Patients in coma can learn simple tasks. Profoundly retarded children can learn simple tasks. So you can't say people can't learn. I don't think you could say that's true of anybody. Everybody can learn something. And then what about generalisation? Well, teaching generalisation is part of our rehabilitation programmes. So how can you say this patient can't generalise? So I'm a bit concerned with that particular model, and I think they might be self-fulfilling prophecies if you followed that. But as I say, I think it was the first paper to try to address models. Now, I'm now going to say something about the theories and models that influenced me early in my career. The errorless discrimination learning from Terrace and his work with pigeons in the 1960s, that's one of the contributing theories towards all the work that's been done on errorless learning in memory rehabilitation. Then a very important person, I think, in neuropsychology, Norman Geschwind, his work on disconnection syndromes, which I read as an undergraduate, was also very influential. There's Norman. The Salk model from behavioural psychology, which I learned when I was doing my clinical training, I think is adaptable to a wide range of problems and situations. The working memory model I've already touched on. And the dual root, there's Alan Baddeley's work for the working memory, and Max Coltart, who did the dual root model of reading. Now, let me just say a little bit about some of those. The errorless learning. Now, that came from two theoretical backgrounds. The errorless discrimination learning from behavioural psychology, which was first done by Terrace, working with pigeons, and then it was taken up in the field of developmental learning disability. And still used there today. And that's where I first came across it, because when I first qualified, I worked with severely mentally retarded children. Right. The other theoretical strand is the implicit learning from cognitive psychology, and a whole range of studies have shown that memory impaired people have normal or nearly normal implicit learning. And these are just some of the early papers. Now, errorless learning is a teaching technique whereby people are prevented as far as possible from making mistakes while they're learning a new skill or acquiring new information. And you can carry this out in a number of ways. You can provide spoken instructions or written instructions. You can guide a person through a task. It's a principle rather than an actual approach. It's a principle. And what you want to do is avoid mistakes being made during learning and to minimise the possibility of erroneous responses. Now, in 1994, Alan and I published our first paper on this, and our question, this wasn't the title of the paper, but this was our question: do people with amnesia learn more if prevented from making mistakes while learning? And my background had been from the errorless discrimination learning, and Alan's background was more from the implicit memory and learning in amnesic patients. Now, our first study, we had 3 groups of people. We had 16 young controls, 16 elderly controls, and 16 people with dense amnesia. And Clive Waring was one of those. In fact, both of those people you've seen were in that study. Now, we used the STEM completion procedure under 2 conditions, error full and error less. So in the error full, we're forcing them to make mistakes. So I would say, I'm thinking of a 5-letter English word beginning with QU. Now, can anybody here tell me a 5-letter English word beginning with QU? Quest? Good guess, but it's not right. Question, that's too many letters. It has to have 5 letters. Quick, good guess, but it's not right. Quinn, good guess, but it's not right. Quiet, good guess, but it's not right. So I'm forcing you to make mistakes. Okay, that's how we force the mistakes. The correct word was quote. And then in the experiment, everybody wrote down the correct word. And in the other condition, they were prevented from making mistakes. So I'm thinking of a 5-letter English word beginning with PR, and the word is prize. And again, wrote down the correct word. Everything's counterbalanced. Some people have error full first, some have error less first. The words are switched, so they're in different conditions. And then we looked at the probability of learning. Well, with the young controls, error less slightly better than error full, but they're almost at ceiling. The elderly controls, again, slight difference, less good overall. But with the amnesic patients, well, they're less good overall, but there's a big difference between error full and error less. In fact, every single one of those 16 people did better under error less learning, every one of them. And I changed my clinical behaviour overnight because the results were so powerful. So the conclusions from that study: errorless learning was more effective than error full learning. This advantage was greater for people with amnesia, and amnesic people showed less forgetting under errorless learning. But I'm not in the business of rehab to teach people lists of words. They've got to do real things. So the second question was, does this principle apply to real-life tasks? But, oh yes, to go back to this, we shouldn't ask people with amnesia to guess. Guess what your name is, guess how to get to physiotherapy. Guess it's wrong, because in order to benefit from our errors, we need to be able to remember them. So the next question was, can we apply this to real-life tasks? And in the same year, we did another paper applying errorless learning to real-life problems. We looked at a man, quite a well-known man in the literature, who has both amnesia and agnosia, one of the patients that Elizabeth Warrington has written about, and we taught him some object recognition. A man with Korsakoff syndrome, we taught him to program an electronic organizer. Well, what we did with all of these patients, we had matched tasks, half of which were taught in an error-full way and half of which were taught in an error-less way. A man with a thalamic stroke, learning the names of people, and a man in post-traumatic amnesia, learning orientation things, like the name of the hospital or the name of the ward he was on. And every one of those did better under error-less learning. There's very strong evidence that errorless learning for memory-impaired people is what you should do. You shouldn't ask them to guess. Now, since then, it's been applied by us and a number of other people clinically. And the last paper came out earlier this year, teaching somebody new routes using an errorless learning procedure. So, us and the other studies, we've used errorless learning to teach several everyday tasks to people from different diagnostic groups, of different ages, and at different times post-insult. And errorless learning is superior to trial and error learning for people with severe memory problems. Said all that. But you do need to ensure active participation. They mustn't be passive recipients of this new information. And you need to incorporate other principles from learning theory and memory rehab. It's not clear about errorless learning for other cognitive problems, for example, language. In fact, there's mixed evidence there. And a good review was by Fillingham et al. 2003, but her group has produced a number of other papers now looking at errorless learning with language-impaired people. And the bottom line message there is there's no real difference between errorful and errorless, but the patients prefer errorless because they're not failing, and nobody likes to fail. So if there's no difference, you might as well use errorless. But with motor problems, we don't know. The right studies haven't been done. And theoretically, there's a lot of argument about does it work through implicit memory, explicit memory, or both of these. Now, our group, and our last paper on this theoretical aspect was in 2006, and we believe it must be implicit learning, because somebody like Clive Waring can benefit, and he's got no explicit memory functioning at all. I mean, that's not the only reason we did experiments to back this up, but we're convinced it's implicit learning. So why does it work? Well, in order to benefit from our mistakes, we need to be able to remember them. And people here, we can start to learn, say, to program an electronic organizer. We make a mistake, and we think the next time, oh, I mustn't press that button, it's the wrong one. But you can't do that if you have a memory problem. So you don't want the errors to get in the first place. So if errorless learning depends on implicit memory, which we believe, that system is not good at eliminating errors. It's your episodic memory system that does that. And the people, like the severely amnesic people, they only have implicit memory functioning, working in any way reasonable. And if they make an incorrect response, because they've no way of knowing or remembering that was incorrect, they may strengthen the very response that the very incorrect response. So you don't want them to make it in the first place. Oh, and here's a photo of Norman Geschwind, taken in Thessaloniki, Greece. This is a very special picture because this was taken about 2 months before Norman died. So it's one of the last photos, at a conference. It was a conference on reading disorders. But his work on disconnection syndromes, it helped me to make sense of people I was seeing with apraxia or agnosia or letter-by-letter reading. All of those you can explain through Norman Geschwin's disconnection syndrome models. And then the Salk model. Now, this is from behavioural psychology, but I've applied it to cognitive problems, motor problems, behaviour problems. It's a set of it's a structure. And you know the feeling when you're seeing a new patient and you think, oh my God, I've got to do something with this person. What am I going to do? And you get a bit panicky. And you have this structure and it enables you to take a deep breath and get on with whatever it is you've got to do. So what does it stand for? Well, the S is stimulus. Now, a stimulus can be a physical stimulus, a social stimulus, or even an internal event that triggers a problem. O is the organism, and that's basically the person's biological condition. So if somebody's got a hemiplegia or can't see, you take that into account when designing your program. The R is response. Now, response could be a motor response, it could be a cognitive response, it could be a physiological response. Then the K is actually, should be another C, but they write it as a K, is contingency, and that's the schedules of reinforcement in operation. Is it getting continuous reinforcement, partial reinforcement, whatever. And then the final C is the consequences. And the consequences of a particular behaviour might be physical, social, or self-generated events that follow a behaviour. So it gives you a structure to follow. And you can take into account the effects of the neurological insult and the resulting cognitive strengths and weaknesses. You can work out what's maintaining the behaviour. Is it continuous reinforcement, partial reinforcement? You recognise you need to set the tasks within the patient's capabilities. You want to avoid a reinforcement of inappropriate behaviour and strengthen appropriate behaviour. And 3 very easy ways to do this in rehab are praise, rest and feedback. And they're often the simplest ones to use. It's not the same in rehab as, say, if you're working with a severely behaviourally disturbed person, because most of our patients in rehab, they want to do well, and success, it might be reinforcing enough in itself. And the other thing about the behavioural psychology side is we've got this huge range of strategies there, which we might have to modify, but they are there. There's shaping, there's training, there's modelling, positive reinforcement, extinction. There's a whole range of them that we can say, well, we might be able to modify this to use with our brain-injured patients. Sorry. And lots of examples in the literature. Right, then back to the working memory model. Of Badley and Hitch, and then modified further by Badley. Now, this is part of the working memory model. This is the central executive, which is the controller and allocator of resources, aided by the visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop. And this has led to a lot of research and treatment strategies. Now, the central executive part of this, I'm going to talk about this afternoon in the workshop and talk about some rehabilitation techniques derived from this idea. But I want to talk not so much about this. The phonological loop, that's impaired in people with, say, conduction aphasia. It's impaired in children, not always, but sometimes in children with developmental dyslexia. This one's written less often about, but I'm going to tell you, this is a case study now, a patient that I wrote up with Alan Badley and Andy Young in 1999. But to me, this was a very important patient because I nearly missed what was wrong with her. And the reason I finally got it right was because of this model. So Giselle, she was a 55-year-old, well-educated and talented woman who was a sculptress. And I was asked to see her for help with her memory problems, and would I do a memory assessment and advice for her, which I get all the time. It's one of the commonest referrals to me. And she'd had lupus, and she'd had a recent outburst of this lupus. Well, I just assumed she was like any other patient coming along to see me with memory problems. So I did all the tests, I did intelligence tests, naming tests, planning tests, memory tests. And on all the memory tests, she was down a little bit, but not enough to be too bothered about. And I thought, she's a very intelligent woman. She's gone down a little bit. Her IQ is very high still. She's gone down a bit. She's just over-anxious about this small drop in her cognitive abilities. That was my first thoughts. And like anybody else, I saw her afterwards to feed back the results of the assessment. And when I told her this, she said, "No, you're wrong. I really do have memory problems." And she was so sure that I had to believe her. And she started to give me some examples. So the first thing she said, she talked about going into a church recently with her husband. And she said, we were in this church and there were stained glass windows on either side. And I said to my husband, "Look at those windows, aren't they beautiful? And they're identical." And she said, he looked at me very surprised and said, "They're not identical at all." Then she started to tell me about problems getting dressed. She said, "I don't have any problems putting the clothes on and off, but I can't see what clothes go together and what colours go together." And the next thing she said is, "I'm expecting a new grandchild, my first grandchild, and although I'm looking forward to the baby, I can't see myself holding it." And then she said, "I can't visualise where things go. I can't sum up, draw on my fund of knowledge, and it's affecting my sculpting." And suddenly I thought, oh, does she have a visual spatial sketchpad deficit? And it was only after me almost saying it was a neurotic problem and her giving these examples, I suddenly thought, I wonder if that's what it was. So I went off to talk to Alan Badley and Andy Young, and we started to do some formal assessments to see if our hypothesis was correct. Now, one of the things I got her to do was bring in some photographs of her sculpting. And these were done prior to the episode of lupus, right? So 2 very nice pieces of sculpture, lots of detail, fingers and toes. And these are 2 she'd done since the episode. They're very, very different, very abstract. And I got her to describe her favourite piece, this one. I said, so I had the photograph in front of me. I said, "Can you tell me what your favourite piece looks like?" And she said, "One hand's on her tummy. I don't know what side she's lying on. How terrible. All the weeks I spent on it. Is one hand under her head? I suppose the knees are bent because you can't lie with them straight. Are her eyes closed? I don't know if she has short or long hair. It's not clear. It's such an effort. I live with these. They're around me all the time, and yet I couldn't draw it for you." So she's very articulate about what her problem is. But then she's talking about her sculpture. She said, "Once I put 4 legs on a man, and I can't see where things come. For example, I can't think where the eyes go or where the foot goes, and I have to keep checking where the thumbs are. I can't keep work in my head the way I used to." And then I asked her to draw some things from memory. Now, this is her attempt at a camel, and this is her aeroplane. And she said, "I wasn't a brilliant drawer, but I was a competent drawer." And for somebody who's an artist and does those sculptures, to be drawing like that is very poor. Another task we gave her was an immediate visual short-term memory task. So what she has to do here is look at this matrix for 5 seconds. Okay, you're all having a good look at that. And then she's shown another one, and she has to say which square is different. She has to point to the square that's different or mark it with the pencil. Now, that's so easy. All of you would have got that right, I'm sure. And even people with Alzheimer's disease will get these right. but she didn't. She couldn't do it. And this is a more complicated one, so have a look at this for 5 seconds. And which square is different. I'll go back so you can test yourself. Now, many of you will have got that right too, but of course that was far beyond her. So that was an example of how I nearly, in the paper we describe it a clinical and scientific puzzle. And it was only because of knowledge of that model that it dawned on me what might be wrong, and we tested it out. Now, the other model I said influenced me, this is from a number of years ago, but it was published in 1985. But Max Coltart was my PhD supervisor, and so I knew about this model long before it was published. Now, it's been a very influential model in understanding reading disorders. So let's suppose you're asking somebody to read something, and you show them a stimulus on a card. Let's say the word cat. Right. Then they have to do some kind of visual feature analysis. For example, tell you if the word cat is upside down or not. Then the next thing they have to do is identify the letters in the word. C-A-T, cat. Right, but after that, there's at least 2 ways you might read that word. You could read it phonologically. K-a-t is cat. Or you could read it by the whole word. You know the word cat, it's a common word. And you could say cat, and then you come up with your response. Okay, now let's take this word, common word in English. Nick, can I use you as a guinea pig? How would you read that word? Yeah, no, just read, just say it aloud. Mint. Mint. Now, that can be read either way, m-in-a-t, or you could read it as a whole word. You know it's the word mint. All right, now, what about this one, Nick? Gint. Now, I assume you've never come across that word before. It doesn't exist in English. It's a nonsense word. It's a made-up word. But nevertheless, he read it gint, as most people would. So he has to be using this root. He has to be going j-in-a-t. He can't be using this root because it doesn't exist in his lexicon. All right, well, I'm telling you Max's arguments. This was way back, this was like 1980. Okay, now what about this word? Pint. Very good. Pint, he read it correctly as pint, as in a pint of beer. Now, he has to be using this root, otherwise he'd read it as pint. If he was using the phonological root, he would say pint. But he said it as pint, so it has to be there. It's a highly irregular English word. It's the only word in English ending in int that does not make an int sound. Think of all the others, squint, lint, hint, winter. They all make int sounds, except pint, so it's highly irregular. And you only can read that correctly if it's in your lexicon. Okay, now this is what I thought was clever. In 1980 or thereabouts, Max Coltart said, there must be patients out there with damage to this root, but not to this one, and vice versa. Now, at that point, these patients had not been identified. He predicted we would find them. And he made up a little screening test that he gave to all his clinical psychology friends like me and all his speech and language therapy friends who were working with brain injured people. And every patient we saw, we gave them the screening test. And we found them. There are people out there who can't read words like gint, and they are said to have a phonological dyslexia. And there are people out there who can't read the irregular words like pint or yacht or ache. And they are said to have a surface dyslexia because they're reading the surface structure of the word. Now, I thought that was really clever, that he could make this prediction, and before anybody had identified the patients, and we went out and found them. But what happened as a result of that is it revolutionized our assessment and understanding of reading. Now, before that, if I was assessing a brain-injured reading-impaired person, I'd give them a word list to read, and I'd give them a comprehension passage. And now, of course, if we're, yes, this is the Chanel graded word reading list, or the British Ability Scales word list, and the Neal passages for comprehension. But now, what do we do if we're assessing reading in any detail? We look at regular and irregular words. We look at parts of speech. We look at concrete and abstract words. We look at aids of acquisition. We look at imageability, and so forth. So I can't tell you how much it changed as a result of that one model, because I was in it at the time. Now, let's say a bit about assessment. So, assessment refers to the systematic collection, organisation, and interpretation of information about a person and his or her situation. It's also concerned with the prediction of future behaviour in new situations. This is an old definition now, but I think it captures what we do. So we're collecting, organising and interpreting information. And depending on what your question is, you're going to use very different styles of assessment. If you're asking a theoretical question, like are there double dissociations between people who know where things are but not what they are, and vice versa, you do one thing. If your question is this woman safe to return home, or can this child go back to school, you do a completely different kind of assessment. But the main sort of models or paradigms or approaches to assessment, there's the neuropsychological procedures, and they could be subdivided into the psychometric, the ones mostly based on psychometrics, the localization approaches, the approaches based on cognitive theoretical models, models of exclusion, which is how neuropsychology started way back at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries, the ecological models, which I'm very interested in, and then the behavioural, or if you prefer, functional assessments through observations, self-report measures, interviews, and so on. Now, the psychometric approach is based on statistical analysis. You establish a procedure for administration, you collect norms from a representative sample, you develop a scoring procedure, determine reliability and validity, and perhaps the best known examples are the Wechsler scales, the Wechsler various IQ scales and the Wechsler memory scales, among the most widely used tests in the world. Then there's the localization approach. Now, when I started in neuropsychology, this was the main reason we did a neuropsych assessment. We had to help the neurosurgeons understand which bit of the brain was damaged, and so they tried to avoid the language areas, that kind of thing. It's much less so now, because we've got MRI scans or CT scans, even though they don't pick up these diffuse axonal injuries and so forth. And I think tests of frontal lobe damage may still be fairly widely used. And people interested in anatomy still use tests of localization. But it's much less the reason for doing a neuropsych assessment these days. Then the theoretical models from cognitive neuropsychology. And some of these have had a great influence on recent assessment procedures. So I've talked about the dual root model of reading, but other models of language and reading, the PALPA, that will be familiar to the speech and language therapists, psycholinguistic assessment of language and processing ability. I think that's what that stands for. But tests of memory, perception and attention that have grown out of theoretical models. For example, one of Alan Badley's tests is the Doors and People test of visual and verbal recall and recognition. Which I'll give you, I think it's this afternoon, I'll give some examples of that. Then we come to the definition by exclusion, which was one of the earliest approaches to neuropsychological assessment. And what you have